So tell me what it means to be a socialist.
A democratic socialist. What it means is that one takes a hard look at countries around the world who have success records in fighting and implementing programs for the middle class and working families. And when you do that, you automatically go to countries like Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, other countries which have had labor governments or social democratic governments. And what you find is that in virtually all of those countries, healthcare is a right of all people, and their systems are far more cost effective than ours. College education is virtually free in all of those countries. People retire with better benefits. Wages that people receive are often higher. Distribution of wealth and income is much fairer. Their public education systems are generally stronger than ours. And by and large, their governments tend to represent the needs of their middle class and working families rather than billionaires and campaign contributors. So when I talk about being a democratic socialist, those are the countries that I am looking at, and those are the ideas that I think we can learn a lot from.
So what is the underlying principle there then? What are the situations in which you look at a given area of the economy or a given service people need, and you say that's something we should turn over to the market, or that's something we should possibly federalize?
Good question. And the answer is, when you take something like healthcare, now, healthcare to my mind is a right of all people. Okay, that's what I believe. I think every man, woman, and child is entitled to healthcare. And that right exists in virtually every other major industrialized country on earth. We are the odd guys out there. Despite the modest gains of the Affordable Care Act, we have 35 million people who still have no health insurance, and more importantly, millions more are underinsured with high copayments and high deductibles. So I believe that healthcare should be a right. I believe in a Medicare for all people, and I think that is not an area where private insurance companies should be functioning, because once you have private insurance companies there, their goal is to make as much money as possible, not to provide quality care. So in terms of healthcare, yeah, we should have a public healthcare system guaranteeing healthcare to all people in a cost-effective way. I think a Medicare for all single-pay approach is the way to do it. In terms of education, I don't know how you have the United States being competitive in a global economy if we do not have the best educated workforce in the world. What does that mean? It means that everybody should be able to get all of the education they need, regardless of the income of their families. What does that mean? It means that we should go back to where we were 50 years ago and what other countries around the world are doing, Germany, many other countries, and say, you want to go to college? You have the ability to go to college, you have the desire to go to college. Public colleges and universities will be tuition free, because education must be a right of all people. So it seems to me that when you look at basic necessities of life, education, healthcare, nutrition, there must be a guarantee that people receive what they need in order to live a dignified life.
Implicit in what you just said, and knowing some of your sort of policies around this, you want to see the government bargain down healthcare prices quite a bit lower than they are now. Americans pay much higher prices.
Let me interrupt you. The answer is absolutely yes.
Yeah. So I have a slightly different question off of that, though. The argument people make about that is that a tremendous amount of healthcare innovation around the world are other countries freeloading on the amount of money Americans pay to induce innovation in the pharmaceutical sector and the medical device sector. Do you worry that if we got to that point, we would actually see a slowdown in healthcare innovation?
I don't. A lot of the money in healthcare research goes into Me Too drugs, copycat drugs, where they will come up with another drug that really doesn't substantially increase the kinds of benefits that it has on the patient. In my view, this issue of high prescription drugs, the high cost of prescription drugs, is a huge issue. It's an economic issue. It is a moral issue. And I very much reject what goes on in this country right now. Right now, in America, uniquely among major countries, drug companies can double the prices for a drug tomorrow for no particular reason, just because they can make more money. We have seen that with name brand drugs. Now we're seeing it increasingly with generic drugs. So I think absolutely that the cost of prescription drugs should be regulated. I will never forget, it's a kind of a moment that one will remember for my whole life. taking a group of Vermont women across the border to Canada, where they purchased medicine they needed for breast cancer at 1/10 the price they were paying in the United States of America. And I also find it very interesting that many of my friends who are great free traders, who want to see lettuce and tomatoes brought in from small farms in Mexico, no problem with that. I think we cannot import name brand prescription drugs from other countries around the world. That speaks to the power of the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry, pharma, enormously powerful lobbying forces, forcing us to pay very, very high prices in this country. I talk to physicians who work in working class communities, and they tell me 1/4 of the prescriptions they write are not filled. That is insane. So I think we need to deal with the cost of prescription drugs very, very differently than is currently the case.
Something that is in that answer, but also in what you said about being a democratic socialist, is a more international view. But I think if you take global poverty that seriously, it leads you to conclusions that in the US are considered out of political bounds. Things like sharply raising the level of immigration we permit, even up to a level of open borders, about sharply increasing
Open
the amount
borders?
of foreign aid.
No, that's a Koch brothers proposal. The
Really?
idea, of course, I mean, that's a right-wing proposal which says essentially there is no United States.
But it would make a lot of the global poor richer, wouldn't it?
And it'd make everybody in America poor. Then you're doing away with the concept of a nation state. And I don't think there's any country in the world which believes in that. If you believe in a nation state, or in a country called the United States, or UK, or Denmark, or any other country, you have an obligation, in my view, to do everything we can to help poor people. What right-wing people in this country would love is an open border policy. Bring in all kinds of people who work for $2 or $3 an hour. That would be great for them. I don't believe in that. I think we have to raise wages in this country. I think we have to do everything that we can to create the millions of jobs. You know what youth unemployment in the United States of America today? If you're white, a white kid, high school graduate, 33%, a Hispanic, 36%, African American, 51%. You think we should open the borders and bring in a lot of low-wage workers? Or do you think maybe we should try to get jobs for those kids? So I think from a moral responsibility, we've got to work with the rest of the industrialized world to address the problems of international poverty, but you don't do that by making people in this country even poorer.
So then what are the responsibilities we have? If that kind of zero-sum calculation, right, between someone who is poor by US standards, but is quite well off by, say, Malaysian standards, redounds so easily to the benefit of the person in the US, and how do we think about that responsibility? I guess I'm asking here I agree, you have a nation-state structure. You always are going to. The politics don't allow anything else. But I guess philosophically the question is, how do you weight it? How do you think about what the foreign aid budget would be? How do you think about poverty abroad?
And I'll tell you why. Well, first of all, again, as a United States Senator from Vermont, my first obligation, frankly, is to make certain that kids in my state and kids all over this country have the ability to go to college, which is why I am supporting tuition-free public colleges and universities. I believe we should create millions of jobs rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure and ask the wealthiest people in this country to start paying their fair share of taxes. I believe we should raise the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour so people in this country are not living in poverty. And I think we end the disgrace of some 20% of our kids living in poverty in America. Now, how do you do that? What you do that is understand there's been a huge redistribution of wealth in the last 30 years from the middle class to the top 1/10 of 1%. Now, the other thing that you understand globally is you have horrendous imbalance in terms of wealth in the world. As I mentioned earlier, the top 1% will own more than the bottom 99% in a year or so. That's absurd. And that takes you to programs like the IMF and so forth and so on. But I think what we need to be doing as a global economy is making sure that people in poor countries have decent paying jobs, have education, have health care, have nutrition for their people. That is a moral responsibility. But you don't do that, as some would suggest, by lowering the standard of American workers, which has already gone down very significantly.
Do you think service sector jobs can be made into high wage jobs?
Not only do I think they can, I know they can. If you look at what the culinary workers have done in Las Vegas, you have people who are cleaning toilets, who are making beds, who are making $35,000, $40,000 a year, who have good health care benefits. So the answer is there's nothing magical. I mean, what we have historically seen in this country, until recently, by the way, that if you worked in a union factory in Detroit, and this is changing, sadly, as part of the race to the bottom, generally speaking, you can make a middle-class wage. You made 20, 25 bucks an hour. You had good benefits. You had a retirement program. And that's being attacked every single day. But there's nothing holy about working in a factory as opposed to making a bed or cleaning a toilet. So in the case of workers in the hotel industry, we have seen with good unions, they can in fact earn a living wage and good benefits.
So is it fair to say then that your strategy for bringing back that middle class, for improving those jobs, is about increasing union density?
Oh, absolutely, no question about it.
How do you do that?
Well, you do that by passing legislation which makes it easier for workers to join unions. Right now, it is pretty hard. You got millions, I'm not telling you every worker wants to join a union, that's not true. But you got millions of people who do. But right now, employers are able to take workers, put them in a private room, threaten them that if this company becomes union, we're moving to China. Oh, you trying to organize a union? Well, you've been late lately. I'm afraid we have to fire you. So I think we make it easier. There's legislation which I support, the Employment Free Choice Act, the Employee Free Choice Act, that says if 50 workers in an agency plus one sign a union card, they have a union, and I believe in that.
So that legislation had, as I remember, virtually every Democrat signed on to it in 2008. Democrats had huge majorities in Congress in 2009, and it just didn't go anywhere. What makes you optimistic it can be passed?
Well, I think what we need in this country is to understand that given the power of corporate America, the billionaire class, the big campaign contributors, what takes place in the United States Congress today has nothing to do with the reality of the middle class or working families in this country. It has to do with the power of big money. The only way that real change is going to take place is when millions of people get involved in the political process and tell the United States Congress and any president of the United States that you're going to have to start working for us and not just for the wealthiest people in this country. And when that happens, huge things occur. Let me give you an example. 3 or 4 years ago, if you and I were chatting, and you were to say, well, you know, minimum wage $7.25, that's pretty low, but no one's talking about it. You know what's happened because of grassroots organizing? Not only have cities and states all over this country raised the minimum wage because of grassroots activism. What you saw recently, a few weeks ago, in a Wall Street Journal poll, by a 10% margin. The American people think we should raise the minimum wage, not the 10.10, which Republicans oppose, but to 15 bucks an hour. Give you another example. Social Security. You have heard here in Washington, virtually every Republican wants to cut Social Security, right? That's their mantra. Well, you know what the American people want, according to that same poll, by a 3-to-1 margin? They don't want to cut Social Security, they want to expand Social Security benefits by lifting the cap on taxable income. So when you organize at the grassroots level, whether it's gay rights, raising the minimum wage, expanding Social Security, that's when change takes place.
I think a lot of people would have thought that the amount of grassroots support Democrats had in 2008 would have led to that kind of effect.
Well,
why don't you think it did?
Because the Democrats, to a much too great a degree, are separated from working families. And there are a lot of reasons why that is the case. Are the Democrats 10 times, 100 times better on all of the issues than the Republicans? They surely are. But I think it would be hard to imagine that if you walked out of here and walked down the street or went a few miles away from here and you stopped somebody on the street and you said, do you think that the Democratic Party is the party of the American working class? I think people would look at you and say, what are you talking about? So there was a time, I think, under Roosevelt, maybe even under Truman, where it was perceived that working people were part of the Democratic Party. I think for a variety of reasons, a lot having to do with money in politics. That is no longer the case. In my view, that is exactly what should be happening. Instead of spending all of our time raising money, I think we should go out organizing people and getting them to around a progressive agenda which expands the middle class, which tells the billionaire class that they cannot have it all, which says to corporate America, you're going to have to start paying your fair share of taxes, which says we're going to raise the minimum wage, we are going to make college available to all regardless of their income, that we are going to have pay equity for women workers, that we are going to create millions of jobs rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure. You need a progressive agenda, then you need the ability to go out and organize people. And when that happens, things change here. It's not the other way around, in my view.
And what does it mean to organize people?
Well, that's a great question. In terms of my campaign, on July 29th, we will be holding, as I understand it, at least 1,000 organizing meetings simultaneously all over this country involving 20 or 30,000 people. And what we will be urging our supporters to do is to go out, knock on doors, register the people to vote, talk about the important issues facing our country in a way that the media very often does not. Talk to our Republican friends and neighbors and ask them why they are voting for candidates who are prepared to send their jobs to China, deny their kids the ability to have health care or get a higher education. Engage people in that discussion. I often make the joke, although it's not such a joke, is that if we could spend half of the time in this country talking about why the middle class is collapsing as opposed to football or baseball, we would revolutionize what's going on in America. I want that discussion. I want to know why the rich get richer and everybody else gets poorer. I want to know why the United States is the only major country on earth that doesn't provide health care to all of their people. The only major country that doesn't have family and medical leave so that women can stay home with their kids when they have a baby. Those are the questions we should be discussing.
You talk a lot about the class outcomes in the American economy.
Yeah.
Another way of cutting a lot of these issues, and it came up when you talked about youth employment, is by race. Do you think we need specific issues to address the racial wealth gap, the racial jobs gap?
Sure. But I think, look, everybody knows that racism has existed from day one. I mean, think about what we did to the Native Americans, what people who came from Europe did to the Native Americans, the atrocities committed. Think about the horrors of slavery. Think about what we did to the Asian folks that came to build the railroads and the Asian Exclusion Act. Think about discrimination against Italians, Irish, Jews, virtually everybody else who was not like, the people who are here. And what we're seeing today is, of course, some people developing a wage issue between native-born Americans and those people who have come into our country. When we have 51% of African-American kids who are unemployed, when the poverty rates in the African-American community are far higher than whites, the wealth ownership much lower than whites, of course we have that gap. But what we have got to do is create economic policies that improve the lives of all of our people. The white working class is disappearing. The middle class is disappearing. It's worse in the Hispanic and African American communities. So we have got to come together and develop policies, economic policies, which improve the lives of all of our people. But in terms of prejudice, yeah, of course that's an extra issue. Is there racism in America? Of course there is. We have seen an explosion of that recently.
What about the social networks of politicians? And what I'm asking there is that the most trackable relationship between the rich and the political class are in donations, are in lobbying expenditures. But a lot of the reason that Democratic administrations say have so many Wall Street members in them is that very high-up politicians end up traveling in the CEO Wall Street class. I'm curious how you think the actual class of people's social networks ends up affecting political outcomes.
Well, I would look at it, the answer is you're right, but I would approach it from another way. If I am a regular politician and I need to raise $20 million to run for the United States Senate, or $50 million, where am I going to go to? Do you think I'm going to go to the American Legion Hall? Do you think I'm going to go to a trade union hall, talk to working class people? Especially with Citizens United, this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision. Candidates are increasingly dependent on the very, very wealthy. So if I'm a regular politician, and I'm proud, by the way, that vast majority of our money comes from working people, not from the rich. But if I'm a normal politician who needs to raise $20, $50 million, where am I going to go? I'm going to sit down with the wealthy. I'm going to go to the country club. I'm going to do my fundraisers at fancy resorts. And I get to know those people. But that's the whole point of this corrupt campaign finance system. If you're going to contribute $1 million to my super PAC, well, maybe you're a hell of a nice guy and you like to participate. Or maybe you want something. I think you want something. And you and I are going to become really good buddies so I can do your bidding. In other words, the millionaire class and the billionaire class increasingly own the political process and they own the politicians who go to them for money. And I worry very much, and I say this from the bottom of my heart, that we are moving very, very quickly from a democratic society, one person, one vote, to an oligarchic form of society where billionaires will be determining who the elected officials of this country are. I'm going to do everything I can to stop that.
When you say you want to see elections be publicly funded, do you want to cut the ability to privately fund them?
The first thing that I want to do is overturn the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which is a total disaster. Free speech does not equal the ability of people to buy elections. And what I have said is, if elected President of the United States, any Supreme Court nominee I make will make it very clear that he or she is going to vote to overturn Citizens United. Second of all, I think what you want to do is at least make sure that candidates who are running will have as much money as their opponents who may have unlimited sums of money. Thirdly, I think there are various ways, and we're going to come out with a position on it, various ways that you can approach the issue. One way, which I find intriguing, is that you basically provide $100 for every citizen in the United States of America. And you say to that person, here's your $100. You can make a contribution. You're going to get a $100 tax credit if you spend that $100 on any candidate you want. I think that would democratize very significantly the political process in America and take us a long way away from these super PACs controlled by billionaires who are now buying elections.
I want to make a turn to foreign policy. Is there a particular foreign policy school of thought you ascribe to? Do you describe yourself as a realist or a democratic socialist? I don't know what that means.
Where do you put? I trust we're all realists.
I'm not sure we are.
I don't know what the word means. Look, here's what I will tell you. When you talk about foreign policy, you're talking about many, many things, but maybe the most important thing that you're talking about is war. And voting to go to war is the most difficult decision that any member of Congress has to make. So I'll tell you a little bit about my foreign policy history, if you like. I was elected in 1990 to the House, literally within weeks. You remember the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And the first Bush was telling us the only alternative was war. The only way we can get him out. He got the whole world united against Saddam Hussein, and the first President Bush was the only way we can get him out is an invasion of that region. And I voted no. And that was a tough vote because most people, believe that we should go to war. In 2003, the second Bush told us that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that it was absolutely imperative that we invade Iraq, that our soldiers would come home in 6 months, that we would establish democracy in Iraq and perhaps the whole region, everything would be wonderful. I didn't believe it. And if you check the speeches that I gave on the floor of the House, sadly enough, much of what I said about what I worried about, the destabilizing impact of that invasion, turned out to be true. So, to answer your question, I'm not a pacifist. And I understand that sometimes you do have to go to war. But I think war is the very, very, very last option in terms of Iran, which is what we're dealing with right now. I applaud the President and I applaud Secretary Kerry for their enormously difficult work of trying to reach out an agreement with the P5+1 in Iran to try to figure out how we can prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which to me is an absolute imperative. But you do it in a way that doesn't go to war. And I get very nervous. I get very nervous listening to many of my Republican colleagues who apparently have learned nothing from the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and they're ready to go to war again. That's the simple truth. I'm the former chairman of the Senate Veterans Committee. Most people don't know that. People know that we lost 6,700 brave men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan. They don't know that 500,000 came home with post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. And they don't know what that has done to those individuals and to their families. So before you go to war, you explore every other option. That would be the basic tenet of my foreign policy.
If it came down to it, do you think it is worth it for America to go to war to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon?
That's a hypothesis. I support what you're asking me, a hypothetical, and I surely applaud what the President has done to prevent us from looking at that option.
But you won't say if that was the choice, whether...
Well, that is not the choice right now. The choice right now is whether we, and I've got to examine this proposal, and it just came out the other day, and I can't tell you I've read every word of it. I have not. But what the President has tried to do is to make it certain that we have a verifiable agreement that prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And I applaud him very, very much. And that's where we are right now. And that's, I hope, after examining this treaty, I hope and expect that I can be strongly supportive of it.
Let me ask you then, not a hypothetical, but a retrospective. Should America have intervened to stop the Rwandan genocide?
Yes. But it's not just America. This is the damn problem that we face. We are spending more money on the military than the next 9 countries behind us. And all over the world, for a lot of reasons. I think we're louder on this issue. Where is the UK? Where is France? Germany is the economic powerhouse in Europe. They provide health care to all of their people. They provide free college education to their kids. Well, you know what? Germany and France and the UK and Scandinavia and the rest of Europe, all of us have got to work together to prevent those types of genocide and atrocities. And we have to strengthen the United Nations in order to do that.
Do you view yourself as a Zionist, speaking of Israel?
A Zionist?
Zionist.
What does that mean? You want to define what the word is. Do I think Israel has the right to exist? Yeah, I do. Do I believe that the United States should be playing an even-handed role in terms of its dealings with the Palestinian community in Israel? Absolutely, I do. Again, I think that you have volatile regions in the world. Middle East is one of them. And the United States has got to work with other countries around the world to fight for Israel's security and existence at the same time as we fight for a Palestinian state where the people in that country can enjoy a decent standard of living, which is certainly not the case right now. My long-term hope is that instead of pouring so much military aid into Israel and to Egypt, we can provide more economic aid to help improve the standard of living of the people in that area.
Let me ask you about the economic side of foreign policy. I think one of the overwhelming background issues, and sometimes the foreground issue, is whether the rise of the economic rise of particularly China, but to some degree India and others, necessarily means a diminishment in American power and sway. Do you see it as zero-sum in that way?
No, I mean, I think, and by the way, I should also tell you, when you talk about foreign policy, what you didn't ask me, which may be as important an issue as any, is the issue of climate change. And if you talk to the CIA, and if you talk to the Department of Defense, and I have, what they will tell you is that one of the great security issues facing this planet is the fact that as we see more and more drought, as poor people around the world are unable to grow the food they need to survive, you're going to see migrations of people and international climate. And I happen to believe that when you talk about foreign policy, at the very top of the list is the need for the United States to lead the world, to work with China, work with Russia, work with India in transforming our energy system away from fossil fuels and into energy efficiency and sustainable energy. And this is not just a quote-unquote environmental issue. This is also a global national security issue as well.
Do you think the international capacity and relationships exist to price carbon in a verifiable way?
Yeah, I do. And we've introduced legislation to do that. Look, I happen to agree with Pope Francis and with virtually all of the scientific community. I'm a member of both the Energy Committee and the Environmental Committee. I listen to what the scientists are saying, not only in America, but around the world. And that is, climate change is real, it's caused by human activity. Look at California, it is already causing devastating problems, not only in the United States, look at Pakistan, heat waves. It is an international crisis, and I have to tell you, without being overtly political here, it is an embarrassment to me that we have a major political party called the Republican Party, which with few exceptions refuses to even recognize the reality of climate change, let alone is prepared to do anything about it. That is an embarrassment, that you have a major party refusing to listen to science.
Do you believe we need to price carbon?
Yes.
Would you do it through a carbon tax or cap and trade?
Carbon tax. And I've introduced legislation. It's the simple and direct way to do it. And I've introduced legislation with Senator Boxer to do just that. Once you're into cap and trade, you're into all kinds of very complicated stuff. Folks on Wall Street are going to make a whole lot of money. Look at carbon. Look, we have got to come up and answer a simple question. Are the scientists right or are they wrong? If they are right, they're going to tell us, they are telling us that the planet Earth will be 5 to 10 degrees warmer by the end of this century, Fahrenheit. That will cause cataclysmic changes in terms of drought, extreme weather disturbances, rising sea levels, acidification of the ocean, international conflict. If they are right, I believe they are right, we have got to move in a very, very bold way. We have to do it yesterday.
And then that goes, I think, a little bit to the question of China and India. How do you get the other countries of the world,
Good
and particularly
question.
countries that look at us and say, well, you got all this economic development and
Right.
you made all these riches
That's
off
right.
of cheap energy, and
That's
now you're
right.
telling us we can't. How
Right.
do you get them to make
And it's
changes
a fair
quickly
point.
enough?
And it's a good question and a fair point. Let's understand that climate change, the United States could do everything right. We can transform our energy system tomorrow to significantly cut back on carbon. And yet, if other countries are producing enormous amounts of carbon, the game is lost. It has to be a global commitment. It's not an accident. In China, people are wearing these surgical masks when they walk the streets, and their water systems are being destroyed. They have major, major, major environmental problems. And I think with the role that we can play with our scientific community is to work with these countries and talk about a win-win proposition. Can in a few years solar be actually cheaper than the more mature forms of energy, coal, oil? I believe it can. Wind as well. But we have got to start investing in the kinds of technologies which are useful not only in America, but work with China, work with Russia, work with India. These countries need energy. There's no question about it. No one should go to them and say, you got to cut your energy in half. What we should be able to say to them, we're going to work with you to transform your energy system to make sure that you have the energy you need to maintain a strong economy. But it is not in India's advantage, China's, Russia's advantage to destroy this planet. Nobody gains from that. And I think many of them understand that.
Do you think that America, the way Americans view China's rise in economic development, is accurate or misguided? I mean, particularly there to go back to the question of whether it is a zero-sum competition between us for influence.
Well, I think what the average American sees is that for many decades now, corporate America and the trade agreement with China, permanent normal trade relations with China, accelerated that. What corporate America said is, hey, I'm not going to pay you 20 or 25 bucks at a factory. I don't need you anymore. We're going to shut your factory down. I'm going to move to China, pay people there $1 or $2 an hour. I don't have to worry about environmental regulations. I don't have to worry about trade unions. And I'm going to produce products there, and I'm going to bring them back to the United States of America. Now, is that the fault of China? No. That issue has to do with the greed of corporate America, who sold out American workers and essentially moved manufacturing to China and other low-wage countries. Are Americans concerned about that? Are they concerned when they walk into a department store and product after product after product is not made in the United States, but is made in China? Are they concerned about it? Yeah, they are. So am I, as a matter of fact. Does that mean that we have to make China into an enemy? Absolutely not. What we need is a trade policy in this country, among other things, that works for the American worker rather than the CEOs of large corporations. I voted against PNTR with China. That was the right vote. And if elected president, by the way, I will radically transform my trade policies.
If I were Chinese, though, that would sound very zero-sum to me, because those factories have been part of a tremendous rise in living standards there.
Well, that's great. But you know what? At the same time, the living standards of the American people have gone down. As I indicated to you earlier, I am an internationalist. I want to see poor people around the world see their standard of living increase. But you talk about zero-sum. I don't think you have to do it. A lot of people tell me this. Oh yes, the American worker is going to have to become poorer so we can help poor people in China. I don't believe that for a second. I want to see the people in China live in a democratic society with a higher standard of living. I want to see that. But I don't think that has to take place at the expense of the American worker. I don't think decent paying jobs in this country have got to be lost as companies shut down here and move to China. I think we can work with China. I want to see American workers maintain a strong, I want to see the middle class expand, not shrink. I want to see the Chinese people do as well. But I do not want to see the collapse of the American middle class take place, and I will fight against that as hard as I can.
To go to another continent, do you think the euro was a mistake?
Can't give you, that's a very good question. I can't give you a definitive answer right now. I am concerned, although I will tell you this, of what's happening in Greece. And I am very concerned that the Germans have led an effort to squeeze blood from a stone. The Greek economy has contracted by about 25% over the last 5 years. Unemployment is 26%, youth unemployment somewhere around 60%. And the idea that Germany and the European banks are pushing more austerity on the Greek people, I think, is not only a terrible economic mistake, it's a political mistake, and I'll tell you why. The third largest party in Greece is a party called Golden Dawn. You know who they are? They're a Nazi party. Not even neos. These are real Nazis. And if you remember what happened in 1932 in Germany, when you had hyperinflation, when you had an economy that was in a terrible depression, that's the kind of climate that a Hitler can come to power in. So I think that the European community has got to work with Greece to create economic growth, deal with unemployment, create an economy so that they can, over a period of years, pay back their debt. But you cannot keep squeezing that country. So I have concerns about that.
Let me end on a question about a policy that is getting, seems to be some momentum, but it's not often talked about in Washington yet, which is a universal basic income. You've begun to have people go back to both Milton Friedman and Martin Luther King Jr. who said we should really have a fundamentally guaranteed standard of living in this country.
Yeah, I am absolutely sympathetic to that approach. I mean, that's why I'm fighting for a $15 an hour minimum wage, why I'm fighting to make sure that everybody in this country gets the nutrition they need, why I'm fighting to expand Social Security benefits and not cut them, making sure that every kid in this country, regardless of income, can go to college. But that's what a civilized nation does, what a civilized nation does. And here's the point. This is the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. But nobody in America knows it because their standard of living is going down and almost all of the new wealth is going to the top 1%. That is an issue that we have to deal with. In the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, top 1/10 of 1% should not own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Everybody in this country should in fact have at least a minimum and dignified standard of living. All right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.